Building a robust lower back involves a combination of different, let's just say, types of training. You've got things like strength training, proper posture, flexibility, mobility, core training. All these things need to come together to build a robust lower back. And a back like this can help you minimize risk of injury, improve performance, not only in everyday life, but also at the gym or in any sport that you choose to do. Welcome to this episode of the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about how to build a robust lower back from the ground up. So where you are on that scale could be different for each person, but what we're going to do is to essentially take it from the most basic and fundamental and then build it up. If you are using the gym more, if you are playing sports, if you are relatively fit, but you still have, let's just say, weakness in the lower back, then it may be just some gaps to fill in because you may have some of these parts already. So it may just be on your sort of fitness pie chart, you've got some very strong sections, but you've also got some slightly lesser sections that may need to be filled in. So again, just be mindful of all that. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, sort of the long-term approach, and then we'll be able to build in all the little short-term approaches that make up this long-term approach. So obviously, number one, the big picture, the long-term approach. Well, essentially, it's a whole body approach. And an easy way to think about it is building from the spine outwards. What a lot of people do with their training is they sort of build from the limbs inward, if that makes sense. And that can come from what I describe as like the bodybuilding philosophy, where we break the body up into muscles. So we mainly train the muscles of the limbs, so the arms and the legs, so they get trained a lot. But what we need to sort of do is, in some respects, reverse that and build from the spine outwards. So that, in some respects, is the long-term approach, the whole body approach. And all of that will come together where you will train all of it, but certainly from the start. So when we start talking about the first part of the short-term approach is to build from the spine outwards. So we're going to be talking about the torso and then the hips and the shoulders, because they're the sort of the first joints that we come to. Obviously, we can talk about the joints of the spine, which we will do, but they get trained differently to the limb joints, i.e. the hips and the shoulders. So sort of short term, step number one is the core. So getting core strength, core stability, and core endurance. So we need to get all of those three. And the reason I'm not talking about lower back training, i.e. Training the muscles of the lower back, is that they don't work like limb muscles. So when we train our arms, we might train biceps, and then we might train triceps, and then you may even train the deltoids as well. So you will train those sort of muscles individually. You may train them in the same workout, but you train them individually with the certain exercises that you do. When it comes to the core, we don't want to do that. We want to train all the muscles together, if you will. So they need integration. They need stiffness and stability, so they need to fire at the same time. So when we're talking about the core, we need to integrate the muscles. So as I've described, core strength is the ability to get into a position. So if we just take the plank or the side plank as an example, there needs to be an element of strength because you need to be able to hold that position. You need to be able to get into it first, and that's the strength element. Then we need the stability part of it. So we need the muscles to fire at the right time. So when we come up into the position, all the muscles fire, and that creates the stable joints. Then we need the endurance, which is essentially we're in the position, we got all the muscles firing, now we need to do that for a period of time. So all of this needs to be built around the torso, which is why I always start with the plank, the side plank, the bird dog, and the bridge. If you go to my how to build low back strength and strength endurance, there we go, I'll get it out. If you go to that program, which I'm sure you'll be able to click somewhere down here and find it, these are the exercises that we start from. So the 12-week program that I've written are the first, let's just say, 2 steps. It doesn't necessarily go into the strength training and the big movements, because that will come later. But what we do need to do is, in the first 12 weeks, is build the core, which will in some respects build the lower back. And then we need to work on building proper movement for proper lifting, which will then go into the strength training. So we've started to build the core strength, core stability, and the core endurance. Now, what this will also include with regards to the lower back, and I suppose this is where the specific nature of it comes from, is we need to start building the posterior parts of the core. So we would also include the glutes within this, because they will also support the lower back, which is where the bridge comes in. So we start building the glutes. Obviously, with the side plank, you'll have a little bit of glute medius, glute minimus. There are other, obviously, parts. You've got QL, obliques, and all those, that sort of lateral seam of the body. But essentially, we're talking about the core and that sort of posterior chain of muscles that go through the lower back, or the back and the hips. So we would have the bridge in there. The bird dog, what that does, and again, this is another important thing to remember about training the lower back, is we don't necessarily want to train the lower back muscles. We want to train the muscles around it, so the mid back and the glute. So this is, I guess, sort of the specific part of how to build low back strength endurance. Is when it comes to longissimus and iliocostalis, which are 2 of the erector spinae muscles, they don't directly cover the whole lower back. They cover a lot of the mid back, and then they insert into the lower back, because what they're doing, they've got that long sort of lever arm to be able to hold it in position. So they're stabilizing across the rib cage, so they cross a lot of the rib cage and they stabilize and use the rib cage for that, and they essentially hold up the lower back. So these are the muscles that we want to train, and when we do bird dog, that's what we can get from lifting the arm up and then the glutes by lifting the leg up. So we get those muscles either side that support it and essentially hold everything in position, which is why we need the strength to get into the position, the stability for those muscles to fire, and then the endurance to do it for a prolonged period of time. So we need to be able to do that with regards to the core. Then we come on to the second part of step 1, which is the mobility. So we also need to build mobility of the hips and the shoulders. If you've got an extremely stiff spine, there is a place for building some mobility into the spine and the vertebra. But if you've got a degree of flexibility and mobility at the spine, then we just need to stabilize it. If you've got an extremely flexible spine, then you definitely need to build stability around it. Because if we've got huge amounts of stability, then you need the stability to hold it all in place. And you need the muscles to time to do that. If you've got no flexibility there, you may need to create some flexibility there, because that stiffness is going to cause its own problems. So we need to get a balance of the two. But when we talk about mobility, it needs to be more at the hips and more at the shoulders. Because if we've got mobility at the hips and the shoulders, that's going to help us with our lifting further down the line with strength training and when it comes to the proper lifting part. So this mobility part will sort of overlap into stage 1 and stage 2. But when we are building mobility, the reason, or part of the reason we're doing that, is so we don't compensate at the lower back. Because if we can't extend our hip properly, we're going to extend our spine to compensate. Or if we can't flex at the hip properly, we're going to flex at the spine to compensate for that lost flexibility. So we need to be able to get the right balance of flexibility at the hip, stability at the spine, and also flexibility of the shoulder joint as well. So we need to get all of that in place. And again, as I've mentioned, when it comes to the 12-week program, this is the stage that we're building. So we're building the core, we're building that posterior chain of muscles, longissimus, iliocostalis, glutes, QL, oblique. So we're building all those muscles in and getting them to work properly and adequately. What we're also then doing is building the flexibility and the mobility of the hips and the shoulders, so we don't overcompensate with the lower back, which is going to cause its own problems. Stage 2 is proper lifting. And when we talk about proper lifting, this is what we're talking about, the movement of it. So the hinging of the hip. So what we don't want to be doing is flexing of the spine. So if we go into a like a deadlift position or even a squat position, as I mentioned before with mobility, we need to have proper mobility of the hip so we can get down into that hip hinge without flexing the spine. Now, this obviously will be developed over time. We start it in the 12-week program, but over time it can be sort of improved and honed all the way. And once we've got the proper movement or the proper mobility of the hips and the shoulders, what we then need to do is start honing that with movement. So using exercises like, well, just getting into a hip hinge and sort of holding it, but things like good mornings, Romanian deadlifts, and not having too strict a parameter on how far into it you need to go. A key here is understanding your own flexibility, which is just being aware of your joints, your muscles, how mobile they are, how flexible the muscles are, and going into your depth. So using your hips as much as they can be used whilst maintaining a proper position of the spine. So we're using our range of movement, our specific, individualized, personalized, whatever word you want to call it, range of movement. We do the same with the shoulders. So what we're doing is we're not necessarily building the muscles, we're now building the brain. And one, being aware of what position our joints can go into, or how flexible our muscles are, so we can go into a hip hinge without flexing the spine, and then we can go deeper into that hip hinge whilst still maintaining proper position of the spine. And again, this is something that the 12-week program sort of moves into, because we start using good mornings, RDLs, on the knees, on the feet, to be able to learn that hip hinge, develop that range of movement, because along with building the core, along with building the mobility, and then honing that, will increase those two things. Because if we can build the brain, it will communicate to the body that it can go a little bit further and do a little bit more. So they will all sort of work together physiologically, but also neurologically as well. So that whole communication will be set up between the brain and the body about how the muscles function and how the hips function as well. So we need to get all of these pieces into play. So that's sort of step 1 and step 2, which the 12-week program covers. What we'll now do is move into step 3, which in some respects is like the final step, and that is strength training. Now, when we talk about strength training, we need to be able to talk about the big lifts, so deadlifts, squats, and in some respects presses and pulls. So that could be an overhead press, a bench press, sort of a pulling down or a pulling up exercise, i.e. a pull up or a chin up, and then sort of any kind of rowing exercise, bringing the arms in towards the body. Now, with regards to those are the four, let's just say the four basic patterns. They are all in what would be described as like a forwards and back movement, so like a sagittal plane. But with regards to sort of biggest bang for buck, that's where you'll get it from. We do need to work, again, that whole body approach. You do need to work rotation, which would involve chops, reverse chops, which is essentially a chop is from high to low. Sorry, a chop is from high to low. A reverse chop is from low to high. So it will involve types of movements like that. Also, frontal plane, which is essentially a sideways movement. So again, we're building that sort of rounded movement. But with regards to what we'll talk about here, and just the purposes of explaining everything, we'll talk about the big lifts. Because with deadlifts and squat, we've got the hip hinge. With more so, let's just say a squat, and specifically like a front squat, we've got whole body mobility. We've got ankle, knee, hip, maintenance of spine posture, and also range of movement at shoulders as well. So we've got that with the front squat. What it's also doing is building strength into the muscle with these patterns. And that's where all of my training sort of comes from, is building of patterns. So we need to be thinking about the movements that we're doing every day. We're pushing things away from us, we're pulling things towards us. We may have to lift our body up. We will need to lift objects off the floor, which is where deadlifts and squats come in. So from an everyday function perspective, that's why these movements are so good. And then we can add in rotation, because that will be included, but let's just say to a lesser extent. So we've got strength training. Now, how long each of these stages takes, again, that's sort of that's where a sort of art comes into it. The science, I've set up the 12, obviously the building low back strength endurance as a 12-week program. So there is a beginning and an end to it. Because with regards to something online, there needs to be a beginning and an end. But it may mean that it needs to go on a little bit further. It may mean that you complete it a little bit quicker. That is, again, that's down to your individual sort of perspective and fitness. But when it comes to strength training, again, there's the art to it. There is no time limit on that, but you will need to build the patterns, and you will need to build strong patterns, which is why we talk about these pulls and pushes. And when we do these pulls and pushes, what we're looking at, again, is range of movement of the limbs, so the hips and the shoulders, and in some respects, the elbows and the knees. And when we talk about front squat, the ankle as well, and also wrist flexion as well, so that will come into it. And also, we need to build in proper maintenance of the spine. So again, as I mentioned, we talk about that during proper lifting, but we're doing that at much lower loads. What we need to do is do that at a much higher load, which is where the strength training comes in, which is where muscle activation comes in, which is where the maintenance of these tissues come in. And when we do it under load, our body can use that stress as like an indicator of it's being used, therefore I'm going to keep it. Because if it's not being used, you will lose it. So we need to maintain the range of movement, we need to maintain the posture of the spine, and we need to maintain the load within these two. And then what your body will do is it will learn those positions, and those positions will become second nature. So that is, without going into sort of detail about the exercises and how to do them and this, that and the other, that is essentially why we do strength training, certainly at sort of building a robust lower back level, is maintaining patterns and maintaining function, because we're using load, which indicates the function that we are requiring from our body. The final step to all this, which isn't really a step because it blends and molds into all of these, is rest and recovery. Now again, there is no set, you should be resting 3 days a week, you should be stretching 3 days a week or 4 days a week. There is no set guidelines on, or set parameters on that. There are just guidelines. Now, with regards to early on, if you've got a weak lower back, early on you'll probably need a bit more recovery, because your body is adapting to new stimulus. So it will need time to adapt, time to recover first and then adapt. So you may need to be doing recovery or rest sort of more often, if you will. What that can include: foam rolling, stretching, massage. Again, in the 12-week program, there is stretching built into it, so there is an element of recovery. But for some people, that may not be enough. There may need to be more. You may need to do additional stretching sessions. You may need to go go for a massage, because if you are stimulating and activating the posterior parts of the body, then they may need that additional recovery. And what I'm going to say, what a lot of people call a weak lower back, I'm going to say is a fatigued lower back. So what a fatigued lower back does is it locks tight, because that's one way of the body overriding the necessity to keep contracting throughout the day. Because if that mechanism, or if the muscle gets fatigued because it's constantly doing that, it will just lock up, and I'll just hold it tight all the time, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So it's just locked up, and it's as it is. And that's the mechanism of what is described as a weak back. It's just a fatigued one that's locked up. So a massage could release that. Stretching of the hips could help relax that. Foam rolling of the upper back and the longissimus and the iliocostalis could start to relax that. So what we need to be able to do is allow that relaxation to happen, and allow the ability of those muscles to recover. Because if you just keep loading activation on top of tight muscles, then eventually they're just going to keep getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and your back is always going to be fatigued, and it's always going to feel weak, if you will. So what we have to do is we have to address that as well, but we need to do it in the early stages when the load isn't as high. Because if we don't address it early and we start doing strength training, then we're building our strength on a crumbling foundation, or a shaky foundation, or a not so strong foundation. So we have to be building that in adequately, in a way that is done properly. So as a general rule, you would start off with a lot of recovery to start with, and then as the back starts to recover and starts to mend, let's say, and as you start working up through into strength training, you may need to start doing less of it, you may need to start doing more of it. That is, again, the art of being able to understand your body and how it's functioning. So trying to think of ways in which, or trying to think about how your body is feeling during the workout, immediately after the workout, and up to 48 hours after a workout. If we can start to do that, we can start to go from working, say, 3 times a week, or working out 3 times a week with recovery, to working out 4 times a week with recovery, to working out 5 times a week with recovery. But at each of these stages, during the core and the mobility, that's when the recovery is most important, because that's when we need to relax off a tight lower back or a fatigued lower back, and then start building in the ability for the muscles to be strong, to be stable, to fire at the right time, and then to maintain that over a period of time. Because that's the only way you're going to do it, is you've got to get that fatigue out of the way and put in its place the strength, the stability, and the endurance. So that is let's just say, like a whistle-stop tour of, I guess, the guidelines of how to build a robust lower back, and in some respects from the ground up. As I mentioned at the start, if you are on the fitter end of the spectrum but you have a weak lower back, you may just need to fill in some gaps. So it's understanding what those gaps are and then filling them in. So that, in some respects, or these are some respects, the signposts to help you on that journey. First of all, build the core, build the mobility with recovery, which could be stretching, foam rolling, and massage. Then start building in proper lifting. So proper lifting technique, joint awareness, knowing where your body is, what it's doing, and then building the strength on top of that with those sort of 4 basic movement patterns, which is the hip hinge, the squat, the press, and the pull, be it overhead or out in front or pulling towards, whatever it needs to be. So that's how I would suggest you go about building a robust lower back from the ground up. So many thanks for watching this episode of the Christopher Hole Training Podcast. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.